All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer, where we take complex research and turn it into clear, visual insights. Today we're unpacking a topic that affects almost every single one of us, literally every single day. We're talking about our constant, unyielding digital connection. We're going to explore the fascinating science of what actually happens to your mind, your attention, and your overall well-being when you significantly reduce your smartphone use or even stop using it altogether.
So, I want you to think for a second about the last time you accidentally left your phone at home, or maybe it just ran out of battery while you were out. Did you feel a little naked? Maybe a little anxious? Patting your pocket every 5 minutes just to check? You know, that lived experience is incredibly common, but beyond that feeling of sheer panic, what is neurologically and psychologically happening to your brain when you finally put the device away? Well, the science on this is absolutely fascinating, and it goes way beyond just the usual screen time is bad lecture.
To kind of frame our journey today, let's look at this quote from Andrew Sullivan, which was highlighted in one of our source studies. He notes that, we all intimately understand the joys of our always wired world, the immediate connections, the endless entertainment, the sheer convenience of it all. But we're only just beginning to get our minds around the costs. And to really understand those costs, we have to pivot away from the obvious benefits of smartphones for a minute and take a hard look at the hidden cognitive toll they might be taking, even when we aren't actively staring at a screen.
Now, before we get into the actual experiments, we need to understand this key term, working memory capacity, or WMC. Think of this as your brain's theoretical mental RAM. It's your cognitive bandwidth. Basically, it's the limited pool of mental resources you use to actively select, maintain, and process information in real time. Whether you're trying to solve a really complex problem at work, or you're just trying to follow a conversation in a noisy, crowded room, you are drawing on this finite mental RAM. Keep this concept in mind, because this exact bandwidth is what researchers believe our phones are actively competing for.
Section 1. The Smartphone Brain Drain.
Back in 2017, a team of researchers led by Adrian Ward wanted to know something really specific. Could merely having a smartphone nearby, not even buzzing, literally just sitting there, actually sap our cognitive resources? To test this so-called brain drain theory, they set up this brilliant experiment. They brought participants into a lab to take tests that measured their cognitive capacity, and they divided them up into 3 conditions. Group 1 left their phones right on the desk. This is the high salience condition. It's nearby, it's in sight. The second group kept their phones in their pocket or a bag, so medium salience, nearby but hidden. And the final group, they actually had to leave their phones in a completely different room out in the lobby, low salience. And crucially, all of the phones were placed on completely silent mode.
And wow, the results of that study were highly revealing. The participants whose phones were safely tucked away in that other room demonstrated significantly higher available cognitive capacity compared to the folks who had their phones sitting right on the desk. They actually performed better on tests measuring both working memory and fluid intelligence. So the researchers concluded that just inhibiting the automatic urge to check your phone takes up a measurable portion of your brain's limited bandwidth. Even if you completely think you're ignoring it, your brain is actively working to ignore it, and that is what drains your mental RAM.
Section 2. Does separation actually help? But here's the thing about science, right? It's a process, not a static set of facts. Human behavior, and especially our relationship with technology, evolves incredibly fast. So the big question is, does this separation effect actually hold up today? Is the mere presence of a smartphone still draining our brains, or have we somehow adapted? Well, in a 2022 study, researchers Ruiz Pardo and Minda attempted a direct pre-registered replication of that famous 2017 Ward experiment. They used the exact same setup, phones on the desk, in the pocket, or in another room, and they ran the exact same cognitive tests. And in the scientific world, a direct replication is basically the ultimate stress test for any theory.
Well, here is the plot twist. The crucial finding from this 2022 study was that there was absolutely no difference in cognitive performance based on smartphone location. The brain drain effect did not replicate. Now, this doesn't mean the original study was somehow fake or badly done. Rather, it highlights this really fascinating nuance. It suggests that the mere physical presence of a silent phone might not universally drain everyone's brain today. It could be that as smartphones have basically become an extension of ourselves, our brains have just adapted to them being there. Or, as the original study even kind of hinted at, the drain might only severely impact people who are already highly addicted to their devices. Science self-corrects, and this shows us that simply locking your phone in another room might not be this universal magic bullet for everyone's focus anymore.
Section 3. The cost of notifications.
Okay, so a silent phone is one thing, but what happens when it actively demands your attention? Topographical brain maps from a PLAWS 1 study literally show our brain's electrical activity. They looked specifically at a signal called the N2 ERP amplitude, which basically spikes when we have to actively inhibit a distraction. When participants heard a smartphone notification sound versus just a neutral control sound while they were trying to complete a focus-intensive task, the brain maps lit up with bright red areas, showing the brain actively upregulating cognitive control. Your brain literally has to work overtime, deploying executive function just to fight off the distraction of a familiar ping and try to stay on task.
Breaking down those PLOS1 findings a bit more, we really start to see the neurological reality of pings. When a notification sounds, participants showed slower overall reaction times on their tasks. Like we just saw, the brain has to work way harder to maintain focus. Furthermore, individuals who scored high for smartphone addiction proneness showed lower early attentional engagement. That basically means their focus was much more easily hijacked. And interestingly enough, the study found that simple, repetitive tasks were actually more easily derailed by pings than complex ones. Fighting the urge to check that notification? It takes measurable, actual attentional effort from your brain.
Section 4. The 3-day detox. So we know for sure that notifications force our brains to work harder. But what happens if you just go cold turkey? Let's pivot to the practical reality of a digital detox. There's this fascinating experimental study by Aldi and colleagues, where participants were completely stripped of their smartphones for an extended period. Looking at the timeline for the 72-hour restriction study, at 0 hours, the experimental group surrendered their smartphones. Done. Within the first 24 hours, the immediate friction was totally practical. Participants reported severely missing what they called process apps. Things like mobile bus tickets, digital calendars, just basic news access. But as they pushed toward that 48-hour mark, something much deeper happened. The severance of their connected online self from their offline self actually began to trigger measurable psychological withdrawal symptoms. They were navigating modern life completely unplugged for 3 full days.
Section 5. Smartphone withdrawal and FOMO. Let's delve into the specific psychological consequences of that 72-hour detox. Because when we say withdrawal, we need to be pretty precise about what that actually means in the context of a behavioral addiction versus, say, a substance addiction. A huge driver of this withdrawal is FOMO, the fear of missing out. It's basically that overhanging concern that you're excluded from enjoyable experiences that other people are sharing. When researchers cut off these participants' smartphones, they didn't just take away a glowing rectangle, they severed the immediate access to their social networks. For a lot of us, the smartphone is the literal bridge to our social existence. And cutting that bridge predictably provokes this highly specific, anxiety-driven social withdrawal.
But here is where we have to be really careful to avoid any exaggerated medical claims. What actually spiked during the detox? Well, specific psychological withdrawal symptoms, FOMO, and practical difficulties with planning and social communication. But look at what stayed completely stable: their general negative affect and general positive affect. This is absolutely crucial to understand. The participants didn't suddenly plunge into a deep clinical depression just because they lost their phones. The detox triggered specific behavioral withdrawal and social anxiety for sure, but it didn't ruin their overall baseline mood. It was a targeted discomfort, not a total emotional collapse.
Section 6. Rethinking your digital habits.
So, as we synthesize all of these varied scientific studies into practical takeaways for your own life, what actually happens when you put the phone away? Well, here's the nuanced science of your screen time. First, the brain drain of a silent phone sitting nearby might not be a universal thing anymore. It likely heavily depends on your personal addiction levels and how well your brain is adapted. Second, notifications are a completely different story. They absolutely actively force your brain to redirect energy and work much harder to maintain focus. Third, if you attempt a true separation, a real detox, expect to feel real specific withdrawal symptoms driven largely by FOMO and logistical friction. But finally, remember this: a detox won't ruin your overall mood. Your general emotional baseline is actually highly resilient.
Understanding all this science actually gives you the power to intentionally design your digital environment rather than just being a passive victim of it. So I want to leave you with one final provocative question to reflect on as we close out today's explainer. Where is your phone right now? Literally right this second. Is it in your hand? Is it sitting on the desk, in your pocket? And more importantly, how much of your mental RAM is it quietly demanding? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.